So let's see. Do a review last week was week 6. It's amazing how quickly these studies grow long. Uh, and so we last week began our look at chronology. It's more complicated than it probably seems or needs to be. Really, we're trying to determine whether things happen in the first half of the 7 years or the second half of the 7 years or at the midway point or at the end. And I think most of the major events are not really controversial, as most people in the larger dispensationalist camp are about the events during the tribulational or the 7 year period, I should say. But there is one that I'm circling and wanting to get to in particular, which is the question of whether the 1260 days of the two witnesses, testimony and plagues and prophecy, is a first half of or a second half activity. I think it's a second half activity, and we're going to add a little bit more to that tonight. Hopefully we can get through all of the major chronology issues, and then certainly we'll come back around to touch some other aspects of it as we go forward. So what I want to do is a little bit of review from last week. The key thing for me, and I suppose for most people with the chronology of the 7 years, once the 7 years are underway, is the location of the abomination of desolation. It seems like a pretty important milestone, hallmark event of this particular 7 year period that Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 12 in particular seem to place that event right in the midway point, somewhere right at in 3.5 years in. And then when we piece that together with Jesus' reference to that event in the Gospels and to Daniel, it places that event at this 3.5 way point. And Jesus says that the Great Tribulation, the tribulation period, occurs after that. So there is this sort of, I think, generally understood misnomer about the tribulation within dispensational circles that's common, I think, at least that I was aware of growing up at a certain point, which is we kind of have, historically when I was a kid, we used the term tribulation to refer to the entire 7 years, or at least I did, not realizing that Jesus places the tribulational period, the part that's the tribulation, the difficult time of trouble, after the abomination of desolation, which Daniel places at the 3.5 year point. So there are certainly things that happen in the first 3.5 years, but the tribulation, I think, more specifically, I think is generally acknowledged to be a second half event. And people can speak up if they've heard otherwise, and I'm not trying to be dogmatic in asserting that to be true. I'm just saying I think that's generally the understanding that's out there, and I would agree with it. So when we look at some of the major events that I talked about, we said we got what's a 42-month period that Revelation 13, 4-7 says the beast reigns. He has power over the nations for a 42-month period in which he is overcoming and making war against the saints. There's a specifically stated 42-month period when the Gentiles trample Jerusalem and at least the area outside of the actual temple house, according to Revelation 11:2. So those are 3.5 year periods, 42-month periods. And then Revelation 12:6-4 mentions a 1260-day period that is alternately in that text referred to as time, times, and the dividing of time, which is a way of saying a year, 2 years, and half a year, which is another long way of saying 3.5 years, to refer to this period where the woman is in the wilderness being cared for. And so there you can see that we have different interchangeable terms for the same amount of time. A 3.5 year period is either 3.5 years or 1260 days, and in these other cases, 42 months. And so all of those events, I think, are generally considered, and I would agree with this, to be second half actions and time periods that pertain to the last half after the abomination of desolation. And so one of the questions I think is relevant to ask when we're starting to discuss more specifically the 1260-day period of prophecy and testimony by the two witnesses, if that's a first or second half event, is all the other named periods of time that are 3.5 year periods, 42 months, 1260 days, time, times, and half a time. If we conclude, which I think most people do, that all of those other ones are second half activities, then why the reasoning would stand to be that the 1260 days of the two witnesses is also among them, that the Bible uses those specific things to designate that specific period of time. Unless, of course, you have some sort of exegetically strong or apparent reason to suggest putting the two witnesses 1260 days in the first half, even though all the other named 3.5-year periods are in the second half. So I think that is something worth noting, but it's not certainly the only reason why we might be inclined to put the two witnesses in the second half, at least that component of their work in the second half. There's a couple of other things. First of all, they conduct plagues, all manner of plagues, according to Revelation 11. If that includes the plagues or some of the plagues that are mentioned in Revelation 15 and 16, then I think we have to say, okay, this period of testimony and plagues is a second half event, because the plagues of chapter 15 and 16 are in several or all cases being applied to the beast, his kingdom, and those who worship him, which are seen to be second half developments. In particular, the two witnesses are able to turn water to blood, which is also mentioned as one of the specific plagues in chapter 16, which is done to those who martyr the saints and who worship the beast, as I understand that text. So that would put them in the second half as well. So we also talked about the woman's flight into the wilderness in relation to Egypt and Sodom and Gomorrah, in which Lot's family is brought out of that, and the Israelites brought out of Egypt. And in both cases, there would be two figures who would lead that movement out. And so I think that implies the activity of the two witnesses, which in and of itself doesn't mean they're there the whole time with the woman in the wilderness, but it may imply that they're alive at the start of that, which then would put them into this 42-month period, or at least heading that direction. So the real issue with regard to the 1260 days of the two witnesses' testimony, prophecy, and plagues is when they die. Not so much when they're resurrected, but when they die. I think most people place the resurrection of the two witnesses at the end of the 7 years. I don't believe that's controversial. Whether they believe that their death is 3.5 days before their resurrection or 3.5 years before their resurrection, in most cases, people place the resurrection of these guys at the very end. And so their death is either at the end, just 3 days earlier, or it's 3.5 years earlier at the midway point, right when the beast takes his first steps to wage war against the saints. So when are the two witnesses killed? And that'll tell us if they're killed at the end, then their 1260 days of testimony is in the second half. If they're killed at the middle, it's at the first half. And again, I don't know how many people really place the two witnesses' testimony in the first half, but there are people out there who do it. So I want to make sure I explain the reasons why I think that's not the case, and give us a full look at some of the issues here. So again, this is not going to be a discussion of whether there's a rapture and resurrection event at the onset or just prior to the 7 years. This is really going to be about whether there's one at the midway point or at the end, I suppose, to whatever extent we're talking about it in this capacity. So if the two witnesses are killed in the first half, they're killed at the beginning of the beast prophecy of 42 months, then that's one option. The other option is that they're killed at the very end. So let's see. If they're killed at the midway point, what does that mean? The tribulation only really starts at the midway point. So you could, and I've heard people do this, just to add more confusion to this, not in criticism of them, but just it's confusing for some people, that there is a belief in a mid-tribulation resurrection and rapture event. Those who hold to what I guess was traditionally called a mid-trib rapture, meaning in the middle of the 7 years, even though it's technically before the tribulation, if it's in the midway point, have argued, at least when I've read and heard it, that it is still a pre-trib rapture because it comes before the tribulation, but because the tribulation only occurs in the second half, the rapture of the church and this event that occurs there is only occurs halfway through the 7 year period rather than at the beginning of the 7 year period. And so if that's the case, And the two witnesses, if the two witnesses die at the midway point, then, and there is a midway point rapture, which I don't think that there is, but for those people who think that there might be, why would the two witnesses be resurrected at the end, which many people think? Maybe they think that they're killed and they're resurrected at the midway points, at the resurrection and rapture that occurs at the midway point. But to me, their resurrection at the end suggests a death at the end, especially if there is no midway point rapture, which I think between the three major rapture points of view, in which you have one at the beginning of the 7-year, a theory that places it at the midway, and then one that places it at the end. I think the midway one is the least popular as far as I'm aware. Now, again, correct me if people have heard something else. I'm not always the most up to speed on what is generally acceptable in the church on this point of view. But I believe that if you place the resurrection of the witnesses at the end and the rapture of the witnesses at the end, you are probably inclined to place their death near that point as well. So there's this question that's going to emerge that we'll eventually cover when we talk about the rapture more specifically. How many rapture resurrection events are there? And I think most Christians, whether they believe in a rapture before or at the beginning of the 7 years, or one at the end or one at the middle, I think they all agree there's one at the end. The question is whether there's an earlier one, right? And I don't know anyone who believes in three stages of this situation of rapturing and resurrection. Most people, as I know it, either believe in just one at the end, or two, where there's one at the middle and one at the end, or one at the very beginning and one at the end. Okay, so those are the options about the raptures that I am aware. So how many are there is ultimately a question we're going to address when we want to focus more on that very interesting topic that I think we can really get into. But for now, as we focus on the two witnesses, I want to talk about the end of the tribulation, rapture, and resurrection event, which again, I don't think is really controversial. There's a question of different agreement positions on whether there's an earlier rapture resurrection prior to the end at some point, but I don't think people are disputing whether there's some kind of resurrection rapture event at the end. And so let me just lay out that issue that there is one at the end, and leave again on the shelf the question of an earlier one for the time being. And let's talk about some passages that'll certainly come up again later when we discuss this, but are relevant to this. First is 1 Thessalonians 4:16, which says, "The Lord will descend with a shout and the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God, and the dead will rise first, and then those who are alive will be caught up in the clouds," which is where we get this in the Greek, this idea of a rapture, the catching up, the going up into the clouds of the living saints to meet Christ in the air, in the clouds, and the dead who have risen just in the second before that to be resurrected. This particular verse does not explicitly declare any time frame cues, beginning, middle, or end. I think people may have some, when we look at it, may have some, insight on why they think this might lead to one or the other. But as I've read it and understood, I don't think people typically use this to say, well, there's a clear indication of the timing of this. Paul could mean it could be referring to an early version, a mid version, or the end time, the end event. But there are some that I think do clearly have the hallmark of a timing with regard to the 7 years. In Matthew 24, verse 29 through 31, and then also in Mark's account where Jesus is talking about this in Mark 13, Jesus says that.
Question? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, back to the point where you said the timing on, you scroll up where it said 1 Thessalonians, it said they will be caught up in the clouds. And you said that word caught up is probably the Greek word, the raptura, where we get the word rapture from. But isn't that also then the placement of where they're caught up to? It says in the clouds and not like caught up to heaven or caught up to heaven. It's interesting how it says it's caught up in the clouds, where it seems to be not up in the heavenly realm or into heaven, but in the clouds, almost to imply, who else comes back in the clouds, riding on the clouds, and then we caught up. So it's almost like that period where they're coming back to the earth, they're caught up in the clouds for a period, but it's just interesting that it says caught up to the clouds and not up to heaven.
I mean, so first I think we should revisit this when we focus more on this question of when this is, because that'll ask, like, where do they go? If there's an early one, where are they at during the remaining years? But I do want to say that you could imply, scripturally speaking, that something that is caught up in the clouds is going to heaven, even as Acts 1 has Christ caught up in the clouds. He goes to heaven. It would potentially be easy for Paul to use that same language to imply that they're going to the clouds and on their as a means to get to heaven. Now, again, I'm not saying that's my point of view, but I just want to say I'm sure that could be something that people would argue. But again, let's if you don't mind, I'd like to shelf that for later discussion. It's a worthy conversation to have, though.
That's the Hebrew word for heaven is the same as for the clouds in the heaven area. So I guess it could interchange for that.
Yeah, that's another way of looking at it too. So. Okay. So when we look at Matthew 24, anybody else have anything they wanted to say on that? I don't want to breeze too quickly by it.
Is the reason you're postponing it is we're gonna find some other cues later on that may help us place that better?
No, it's because this study is a study about the two witnesses. It's not a broad study about anything related to the end times. And there are other end times topics that I think are worth discussing and could produce very enjoyable conversation and exercise.
Yeah.
I
gotcha.
want to mix it all in. Yeah. We could do Mark of the Beast conversation. We can do a number of things, but I'd like to hold that and do just the two witnesses as much as we can. If that's okay. So Matthew 24:29, here's Jesus. He's already talked about the abomination of desolation and things that will happen during the tribulation. And then in verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation in those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And so if this is a reference to gathering together, and I think we have every reason to think of this as the kind of gathering of Jesus' followers from the earth by the angels in the clouds, as we'll see in Paul's very similar language in 2 Thessalonians 2 in just a second, then this is a post-tribulational version of that activity. It's after the tribulation when this particular component of this is occurring. And so now let's go to 2 Thessalonians 2. And you'll see Paul using very similar language in this case. He says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus and our gathering together unto him, that you wouldn't be shaken, lest any man deceive you by any means. For that day, the day of Christ, his coming, that day should come, except there first will be a falling away, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, as he sits in the temple showing himself that he is God. And so here in 2 Thessalonians, and again, I think we'll be right to revisit this to whatever extent we think it's relevant to discuss a possible earlier rapture event. This seems to be an event that he's saying he seems to be focusing on things that happen after the Antichrist has revealed himself and sat in the temple. That gathering together, there's a gathering together that will occur after that. And again, I think most people agree there is a gathering together after this that occurs at the very end, as Paul goes on to describe how this man of sin will be destroyed when Christ returns. That seems to be the return of Christ he has in mind. Again, I'm not saying this passage proves there's no earlier event. It simply, I think, is pointing towards the later version. Again, we can revisit this later, but I'm just trying to highlight there is seemingly a later end of the 7-year period event. Additional passages on this, 1 Corinthians 15, all the way down in verse 50 something. It says, verse 51, behold, I will show you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we, that is we who are still alive, will be changed. And so there's a reference to this rapture resurrection event. There's no mention of rapture here, but I think it's pretty clear that that is part of what Paul has in mind. Here, the timing cue that we have, if any, is that this is something that occurs at a final trumpet. And so, again, I don't think most people dispute that there is a resurrection rapture event at the last trumpet. And in Revelation, we do have a series of trumpets. One of them seems to signal the nearer the end of the 7-year period. If that's the same trumpet Paul's talking about here, then this is, again, a reference, or would seem to be a reference to an end of the tribulation event. And so there's where we can start to tie some things into the two witnesses more specifically. So if we go to Revelation, and we've read through Revelation 8 and 9, we get this introduction of a series of trumpets that are sounded by angels, which are mentioned in some of these passages we just read. And then we get the story of the two witnesses' activities and their 1,260 days, after which they're killed, and then they rise from the dead. And if you read through that whole story, which, by the way, completely interrupts the trumpet series. When we get the introduction of the trumpets, we get trumpets 1 through 6 in chapters 8 and 9, and then we get interrupted. What appears to be interruption doesn't just end with here's the 7th trumpet, and then move on to chapter 10's contents, chapter 11's contents. It interrupts the 7 trumpets and their sequence with the story that crescendos with the two witnesses and their death and resurrection. And then immediately after their resurrection, which is mentioned, and their rapture in chapter 11, verse 11 and 12, it says, at the same hour. So at the same hour that the two witnesses are resurrected and raptured up, called up to heaven, it says at that same hour there was a great earthquake. And it talks about the number of people who were killed. And then it says the second woe is past. Well, this woe reference is part of the trumpet series. If you read through chapter 8 and 9, it explains that before the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet, each one of those trumpets is signified by a woe. Like something very bad happens along with these trumpets for the people of the earth. And so when the 5th trumpet sounds, that's one of the woes. And we get the discussion of the 5th trumpet in chapter 9. And at the end of that, it says the first woe. In fact, I should probably go back and read that. And then the same will happen at the end of, after the 6th trumpet. We get a description of what happens at the 6th trumpet. And then when it concludes, it says second woe. So each time one of the trumpet blasts occurs, we get a description of events that occur at that trumpet blast, and then a statement that woe has occurred, right? So here's chapter 9, verse 11, having discussed the emergence of Abaddon and his minions from out of the abyss. And it says, that's the 5th trumpet. And then in verse 12, it says, one woe is past, there's 2 more coming. And then the 6th angel sounds, and then there's these angels that are released from the river Euphrates and their army with them, and they go about killing and other things. And then it explains that, where's that reference? I wrote it down, but where's the second woe? The second woe, I think I just said it is in chapter 11, am I right? Verse 14, second woe is past. So that would seem to indicate that the timing of the events of the 6th trumpet, at least the culmination of those events, and the death, the things that seem to correspond to the death or the timing of the two witnesses' death and resurrection are near in time to one another. So that the two witnesses' death and resurrection, or at least their resurrection and rapture, is very near to the 6th trumpet and or 7th trumpet, which immediately is the next thing you hear in verse 15 of chapter 11. After the second woe is passed, immediately it follows with, and the 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign, right? And so this sandwiches, so again, the ordering and organization of the book of Revelation is intentional. Whether we understand that correctly or not is debatable, like what that means for us. But it's obvious, I think, to everybody that the ordering and organization of this book is intentional by John and the Holy Spirit to organize it this way. And for some reason, they decided to put the story about the two witnesses, including their death resurrection and catching up into the heavens before and sort of during the trumpets at around the time of the sixth and about before the seventh trumpet sounding. And it would be very easy to understand the purpose for that in light of 1 Corinthians 15 in particular, and what we see in Matthew and in Mark, that there is a point at the very end after the tribulation where a final trumpet is sounded, and there's a resurrection and rapture and gathering of the saints, both from the dead and the living, to meet Christ in the clouds. And if that's the case, which those other elements of it seem to be pretty well established, I think the timing and the placement of this in Revelation would seem to indicate that the death of the two witnesses is also around that time, although even technically, I suppose I'm just showing that the rapture of the two witnesses is around that time. But it seems to be that these things are very close in short order if you read through them in Revelation chapter 11, their death and their resurrection. So I think that's very helpful. Let's pull a couple of other things in here. First of all, similar to these sixth and seventh trumpet time frame events, chapter 16 of Revelation, which has the last plagues that are poured out. Kevin says it seems to be an indication that these are in rapid succession. These plagues that are mentioned in chapter 15 and 16 in particular, poured out upon the beast and his kingdom and his worshipers, and those who killed the saints and the prophets. It's the sixth plague, the sixth bowl. It mentions at that point, and we can interpret this how we want, it mentions the Lord's coming as a thief in the night right at the time it mentions the sixth trumpet, the sixth bowl, which at least seems to indicate that there is an unexpected coming, or at least a coming that some people aren't expecting, or at least the return of Christ, a return of Christ that is around the time of these final bowls and plagues. Again, more fine details and discussion on that, but again, we're seeming to place some of these events. Again, if the two witnesses are involved in pouring out these plagues, it means they would need to be around for this, even as we await a particular time or a return of Christ at the end. Again, regardless of whether there's an earlier return, right? We're just talking about the end of it. Now let's tie in a few other components. Earthquakes and woes and thunder and lightning, right? You might think, well, boy, there's just a lot of bad, tumultuous things happening all over the place in the 7-year period, or certainly just constantly in the final 3.5-year period. But the other alternative is that these particular types of things, this earthquake, for instance, that's mentioned there and in other places, and thunderings and lightnings and voices are a particular singular event. It's and I don't mean to say it's instantaneous and only happens for a second. I mean, it's like, this is the time of the earthquake, the lightnings, and the trumpets. It's a particular, unique point in development, not repeated. And so let's if we look through Revelation and we see the place where this is written, I think it might be helpful. So, for example, we know that we just read this, that at the same hour that the two witnesses are raptured and resurrected, just 3.5 days apparently after their death, there's a great earthquake. The second woe passes, and then the last trumpet or seventh trumpet sounds. And then verse 19, we finished through verse 17 or 18. I think we'd gotten through verse 15 maybe, and it talks about the nations were angry because the time for Christ to reign has come, and he's going to reward his servants, the prophets and the saints, and will destroy those who destroyed them. And it says that the temple of God was opened in heaven, verse 19 of chapter 11. And there was seen in the temple, the heavenly temple, the ark of God's testament, and there were lightnings, voices, thunderings, and an earthquake and great hail. Now, I mentioned before that my understanding of the chronology of Revelation is such that at times, like Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, it will repeat an event in a sequence, elaborate on it, and then place it back into the sequence, or at least give you some clear evidence that that's happening. I don't think that there's two separate earthquakes mentioned in chapter 11, one that occurs in the same hour that the two witnesses are resurrected, and then one mentioned here in verse 19. I think it's the same earthquake that's being discussed, and we're just being told sort of the correspondence or coinciding of these events. The two witnesses are raptured and resurrected in reverse order at the time of this earthquake and a point where there's lightnings, voices, thunderings, and great hail. I mentioned that one as well. Just for a footnote, the earthquake, in my understanding, my guess, is a signification itself of a resurrection of the dead. If you read through the accounts in the Gospels of Jesus' resurrection, it seems that occurs with an earthquake. Maybe it's just the angels rolling the stone aside. Maybe it's only local. But Matthew's Gospel reports that after Christ's resurrection, many of the souls of saints from the past rose out of their graves. And it indicates I think their bodies specifically. So if you think about what would happen if suddenly the remains, especially long decayed remains that have maybe been distributed or dispersed, they weren't all necessarily laid carefully and kept, are suddenly brought back together in a valley of the dry bones sort of scenario where the Holy Spirit of God is miraculously pulling these things and bringing them back to life and forming a body out of these remains. You can imagine that would shake the soil and the rocks and the earth that is around and above these components as people rise from the ground. And I think that's going to be tremendously alarming, not only just to have the earthquake, but what's happening as a reason for that earthquake. And I think that's why we see this earthquake occurring the very hour that the two witnesses are raised from the dead. They're the last to die, probably the first to rise, if you think of the last shall be first scenario potentially applying here, that they are the first to rise, and then for the rest of that period, maybe up to an hour, it's bodies getting resurrected. Now, maybe quicker than that. It could be in a blink of an eye. We don't know. But in that very hour, there's a tremendous earthquake. There's also lightnings, thunderings, and a great hail. So that's all at the seventh trumpet, by the way, as far as we can tell from that. And so let me also go to the seventh plague in Revelation 16, verse 17. Seventh angel poured out his bowl or his vial of the final plague, the seventh of these final plagues. And there came great voices out of the temple of heaven and from the throne, saying, "It is done." So similar sorts of statements being made from voices in heaven. And verse 18 says, there were voices, thunderings, and lightnings, and a great earthquake, such as not have been seen since men were upon the earth. Right? So that happens, verse 21. And there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven. So at the seventh vial or bowl, and at the seventh trumpet, there is a great earthquake, lightnings, thunderings, voices in heaven, and a great hail. Either we think that's happening several times, or it's only talking about the same event. I think the argument is pretty strong that it's the same event in both cases, because it seems to be highlighting the unique nature of this as a particularly important event, something that isn't being repeated regularly, that people haven't seen before throughout this period. It's not like, oh, just more thunderings and lightnings, probably going to be an earthquake, look out for the hail. Seen that before. It seems to be particularly unique. At least that's my read of this. And so with that in mind, I think we can kind of start to see that the way that the two witnesses' death and resurrection seems to be sequenced with that would seem to place their death at the very end or near the very end, which would mean that their 1,260 days of prophecy is just before that, which would also be in the second half and leading up to the very end of this. Alongside of this, we can ask the question, when is the period of martyrdom for the saints in general, right? Not just the two witnesses in particular, but there is a point. We said that the beast receives power or authority for 42 months in which he's making war against the saints and overcoming them, and people are dying. So there's this sense that obviously the two witnesses aren't the only people who are going to die. Chapter 6 at the fifth seal mentions that when the fifth seal is open, there's souls that are already under the altar at that time in heaven, and they're asking for vengeance for those who have killed him. And God says, wait, you're going to have to wait for just a little while longer for the rest of your number who will also be killed, right? So there's going to be another period of this during this tribulation. And so that's more than just the two witnesses. It certainly seems to include the two witnesses. And so when is this general martyrdom, right? It seems to be after the abomination of desolation, because it's in the 42 months when the beast has power to wage war against saints and overcome them. And it's during the Great Tribulation. You wouldn't think of the Great Tribulation as not including the death or attempted death and martyrdom of many saints. So that general event seems to be occurring in the second half. I would say that we're probably likely to put the two witnesses with it. Whether we think the two witnesses are the first two people killed in this or the last, I think all the indications are that they're the last, or they're part of the final group during that final 3.5-year period. And I think we can tie that in, like when you see in Revelation 6, verse 9, that they're told to wait for a little season, right? So I take, and I think maybe people maybe have different views on this, but I take this reference to the souls that are present and speaking at the fifth seal to be souls from a previous period. They've been in heaven. They've been waiting for a long time. They've been killed. We know that saints have been killed all throughout the centuries. Certainly, this is a group that appears to not have been resurrected after Christ's resurrection. So there's probably a group of people that, at the very least, is from the post resurrection of Christ era. And certainly many of the early church fathers and leaders suffered martyrdom and persecution. I can imagine if they've been waiting for 2,000 years, this might be a sentiment we could imagine them saying, right? Lord, how long? We weren't expecting a 2,000-year delay. And here we're having this report meant to introduce, okay, look, you're only going to have to wait a little bit longer. But that little bit longer is the Great Tribulation period, in which there is a huge amount of problems happening, particularly persecution and death for the saints because of the beast and his power. That, again, I'm doing some interpreting in terms of my point of view on this, but this is all seems to be precipitated, right? Like when you read the first 4 seals, you see there's these 4 horsemen that go out that don't seem to be doing anything good, right? It seems to be bad. I think everybody's read on that is pretty, I'm underselling it, right? But I think if you start to read that and you're like, oh man, it's going to be bad, but what about, how long is it going to go on? And what about how long is this death and persecution of saints going to go? And then we're introduced to this element here. Okay, look, it's going to be just for a little bit that they're killing, that these 4 horsemen are killing. We'll talk about the 4 horsemen in a whole nother set if we want to. So then we go to Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. Again, we looked at this last week, but in chapter 12, it says, after the devil is cast down, it indicates that he knows that he's only got a short time. Now, if we are trying to figure out chronology and coinciding of events in Revelation, we should probably consider that when John uses this idea of a short period of time, especially as he's using it in contrast to 42 months, 1,260 days, or at least as in another distinct way of referring to something, he's used it with regard to the period of martyrdom at the 5th seal. He says there's going to be a short time, there's a little time left, little season. He says it with regard to the period that the devil has left, which we know as soon as the devil gets down, he's got a short time left, and he seems to immediately make good use of that time trying to persecute and kill anyone who's following Christ. And then there's one other reference to this, which we'll eventually get to. It's in Revelation chapter 17 again. Don't want to get into the weeds on that, but I think that short time seems to indicate that that's all in that period after the devil is cast out, when we start to see this martyrdom. It's the 42 months after Abaddon and the abomination of desolation. In fact, in Revelation 20, verse 1 through 6, another passage we will probably come to when we do our discussion of the potential number of rapture, resurrection events and their timing. I'm not going to, again, use it for this purpose here. It refers to a resurrection event in which is inclusive of, it occurs when the devil is chained up, the beginning of Christ's reign for 1,000 years. So it's at the end of the 7-year period, at the end of the age. And this event includes the coming to life or the living of people who had been beheaded for the witness of Jesus and the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast, so that, or had taken his image or received his mark. And so this may be certainly seems to be a reference to a larger group of people, right? Whether they didn't worship the beast or take his mark, they had the word of God. This reference to those who are beheaded for the witness of Jesus seems to potentially be at least inclusive of the two witnesses, because the word witness here is very close to the word, the testimony of the two witnesses, the word witness itself. So these are people who have been who've been killed, specifically beheaded, for having the testimony. They are witnesses of Jesus, and they're included in this event of a rapture, resurrection, or at least here what's implied a resurrection back to life from having been killed right at the end of the 7 years, right before Christ's reign starts, right after Satan is, right as, maybe even right before Satan has been thrown into the abyss. So again, that's just, I think, highlighting the
So
end
in
time.
theory, that would be some of us, so to speak. So in other words, our heads would be separated sometime earlier, and then we're coming back. Is that?
I mean, so it depends again on whether or not you believe there is an earlier rapture for saints.
Oh, no, I don't believe it.
I know you don't, but certainly this verse is attesting that some of the people who are followers of Christ during the 7 years, or during the final 3.5 years, I should be more specific, they will be beheaded. That would be one of the manners in which, or maybe the manner in which they are put to death. It's the only place that really specifies the exact manner of death for some of them. And maybe that beheading is only for the two witnesses and the rest of them are killed by another way, but the Greek would allow for either, that this may be the way that this is done for all who die during this period. Certainly maybe all who die by the hand of the beast, or at least under his authority. All right, so which makes sense in the sense that the third plague of Revelation 16:7, this is, I believe, the plague of the water being turned to blood. Again, a plague that the two witnesses seem to be able to conduct is done, the water turning to blood is done because to harm the people who have shed the blood of saints and prophets. Right, so they're being given blood to drink because of this. They've shed the blood of saints and prophets, which may not at this point. They're going to shed the blood of the two witnesses. Maybe they've shed the blood of the 144,000 or some others who were spreading the word of God at this time. And again, that's during the plagues period, prior to the end of the 7-year period. So let's ask this question. The harlot, right? We haven't talked about the great harlot that much, but Revelation 17:6 presents the idea of a great city that rules over the kings of the earth, that is responsible for the deception of the earth, to spiritual adultery, to be unfaithful to worshiping the true God. And it refers to her as the city as the great harlot. And it says in verse 6 that she is drunk with the blood of the saints and the witnesses of Jesus. And the English translation will typically say martyrs, but it's the same word that's used in Revelation 11, chapter 3. So she's responsible for that, which means that so some people will place the destruction of the harlot city earlier on in the 7-year period or at the midway point. The fact that she is held responsible for a group that includes the two witnesses, the witnesses of Jesus, to me means that she's present all the way through the 7-year period, or at least it's an indicator in that direction, which would mean, in my understanding, that this great city is not destroyed until the very end of the 7-year period, when God calls to remembrance all she's done and then destroys her.
In 17:6, where it says that the blood of the saints and the witnesses of Jesus, the one that you were just reading there,
Yeah.
So that witnesses then pretty much is then the two witnesses then. And I guess I always thought that there were the witnesses of Jesus and the saints, but really it says the saints, which you would assume that the saints are also, the witnesses are part of the saints. But because of maybe just trying to distinguish between the regular saints, but then also these two witnesses. It didn't say two witnesses, but it says witnesses.
Yeah, so I want to, at some point later in the study, once we're done with what I consider the sort of upfront stuff, I know it's been not like super basic anyway, but I want to do a discussion of the way Revelation uses terms to see if there's any sort of system here that's not readily apparent. This particular verse, we see the blood of saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. My understanding of Greek, which isn't great, is that when it uses blood in both cases, it's referring to what it understands to be distinct parties. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not overlapping in some sense, right? Like the apostles are Christians, but not all Christians are apostles. So the two witnesses could be part of the larger group of saints, but that doesn't mean that all saints are the two witnesses. And my basic assertion, at least you can take this tentatively, is that when Revelation uses the term witness in the Greek martyrion, I think, in a noun form, the only place that we know that it does that is with regard to the two witnesses. And when we see that here, I think if you're reading the book, it's just straightforward and you go, okay, there's these guys that are identified particularly as the two witnesses. And I don't see anybody else getting that term witness applied to them necessarily that way, in that clarity. One thing that would have to occur to you when you see this here in the Greek is, oh, it's those guys. Now, you might think it could include someone else. It certainly would be inclusive of those guys, but it could be exclusive just to those guys, just to the two witnesses. And so I think that implies, again, that the harlot is present all the way through their 1,260 days.
Just to put a devil's advocate, I guess I have heard some people interpret the blood of the saints, meaning maybe Jewish people at this time, and then when it says the witnesses, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, meaning like Christians, and Daniel used saints, and in the Old Testament sometimes you hear that where they use the word saints referring to Israel, but
it's true. It's certainly, yeah. So this is going to be one of those things that I think we can take more time to delve into when we do look at, see if we can see if there's a specific system of reference in the book of Revelation that is more particular in the applications than in the general biblical usage. Now, again, that's a big thing to suggest. We have certainly to decide whether that's possible. I think that the application of terms for identifiers in Revelation is challenging in the least. And one of the general principles, there's two principles of hermeneutics or interpretation of scripture that are important here. One is you want to obviously take terms in light of their previous usage, right? So here, this is the final book of Revelation. So we'd want to be informed about how terms are used earlier in the Bible, particularly in the Greek New Testament, and say, well, that should be informative about what the range of meaning could be or the specific meaning in any case in Revelation. The other is that each individual book or author can have the opportunity to tailor their application of a word in specific ways, and we would have to look to them for cues of that and see if that's enough, if there's something clear enough to override a general application that's from the larger precedent of the scriptural use of a term. And so those are going to be some of the questions we cover at that point in the study. But in either case, I think most people would suppose that this martyrs of Jesus is at least inclusive of the two witnesses. As I said, maybe it's not unique to them, but I think this is not a controversial position. But for what it's worth considering, even if people come to different points of view on it. Okay, so in any case, the harlot is largely responsible, whoever this is, for killing people before she's destroyed herself. And I think that killing of godly people is in the second half. So this kind of helps us with placing that particular event. So both the harlot and the beast seem to be pretty heavily involved in the killing of godly people, regardless of what specific term we want to use for them. You could call them those who keep the commandments of God, who have the testimony of Jesus. We could use the term saint or prophet. We can use the term apostle. All of those terms are used in Revelation. But if I just use the broader category, godly people, the beast and the harlot city are responsible for doing that. And I think you have to ask, okay, are they doing this in a way that's not related to each other? Are they doing it in separate periods of time? Or is this just two parties that are principally involved in the same activity? And I think that's probably the default, most reasonable position, is that what we're seeing here is a large activity that both the harlot and the beast are instrumental in conducting. And I don't think that that's, again, probably very controversial to people, but it places both of their activity as being, at least in this respect, in the second half of the 7-year period. Where God avenges. So this is a kind of important in Revelation 18:6, it says, in the harlot is found the blood of the prophets and the saints and all who slain upon the earth. In chapter 18, verse 20, it says that God is avenging his apostles and prophets and his servants on the harlot, which is very similar language to Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, where we have these people crying out, how long when we're going to see vengeance? Here's where that vengeance occurs. That's the fulfillment of that statement that God makes just in a little bit of time, and then he does it here in discussion of the end of the harlot city. And it's also true that the harlot receives plagues. Revelation 18:4 and 8 is a place where we're talking about the plagues that are poured out, and God saying to his people, come out from her, that you receive not of her plagues. It seems like because she and the beast are both involved in this activity of persecuting and killing godly people, they are both held responsible for it at around the same period of time, not necessarily exactly the same point in time, but it probably in the same weeks of time at the very end, and that they both received plagues prior to this as part of God's chastising them and punishing them for this ungodly activity. And so I think that that's helpful to sort of put this stuff together rather than having several parties that are all doing deception in different periods, uncoordinated. We have multiple parties all involved in the same activities during predominantly the same period of time. And they may come to slightly specific different fates in terms of how their involvement is ended, but I think it's all at about the same point in time. So let's see. And then this leads up to, lastly, I'll state, there's pretty good timing for tonight in terms of getting done in an hour with the chronology. But Revelation 17:10, it says, the woman, the harlot. So this is how I think we can kind of tie the harlot's activities with the beast's activities, right? If you read about the harlot, it says that as she's introduced, she, in verse 9, there are 7 heads and 7 mountains upon which the woman, the harlot in this case, sits. Now in the Greek, you could read that as 2 separate sets of things, right? There's a set of mountains and there's a set of heads. But it also is the case that you could read it as the mountains and the heads are correspondent to each other. There are 7 of them. Each head and each mountain are connected. That the heads and the mountains are both representing different components of aligned structures, right? And just to give you an insight on what I think that means to help frame what I'm saying, I think mountains is a reference, and I know this will be something a lot of people have different interpretations of, and I don't mean to get into this here. We do it in a different study, our symbols discussion. I think mountains is a reference to nation groups, and heads is a reference here, I think, to angelic beings who are the sort of patron god presiding over that national human empire's time of rule, which is something that comes out of the book of Daniel. It's certainly articulated in some of Paul's language in Ephesians about the angels and ruling from heavenly places, wicked angels. It comes out of Deuteronomy, which states that the nations of men, with the exception of Israel, are divided to, in the Masoretic Hebrew, it says to the sons of Israel. In the Septuagint Greek, it says to the sons of God, which would either be a way of referring to Israel, or more commonly, it's an Old Testament way of referring to angelic beings. At least the early church seems to understand it that way. I take it that way. Again, no, there's dispute on that. But both the nations of Genesis 10 are 70 in number, and 70 is the number of Israel's children that come into Egypt. When Jacob comes to Egypt, it's 70. So it's articulating this sort of relationship that God takes one particular family, the family of Abraham, and says, this is my inheritance. The rest of the nations are allotted to the angels, as a way of saying it. Certainly that's the way Daniel seems to speak of this. And the early church thought of it that way. So it was common among the Jews. So that's what I think, not trying to do an argument on this. I just want to give people an idea where I'm coming from. Verse 10, the 7 heads, 7 mountains, says, and there are 7 kings. Now I think, again, the way this is composed in the Greek, I think it's intending to say that the 7 heads, the 7 kings, somehow correspondent to the 7 heads and mountains. And I think the kings is a way of referring to the angelic prince or principalities associated with these kings. And some people think these are Roman emperors or particular contemporaries in the last period of time. But this is how this is stated in chapter 17. 5 of these kings have fallen. One of the kings is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue for a short space. Now, that short space, again, to me, although not same exact Greek phrase, it's the same concept that we see that seems to be associated here. I associate it because I think when the devil is cast out, he has a short period of time. What does he do? He starts prosecuting and persecuting and killing the saints and orchestrating that. That's why in chapter 6, we're told there's going to be a little period, a short season, in which there's a period of more martyrdom for saints. And here it says the 7th king is around for a short space. And let me just put it this way. There seems to be a sequence to these kings. 5 of them have fallen. 1 currently is, and 1 is still to come. So there's sort of a past, present tense categorization to these 7 kings. They're not all contemporaries, which is why I think some have taken this as a reference to Roman Caesars. Here's why I think they're all angels. Look at the 8th. Look we get in verse 11. The beast that was not, that was and is not, he is the 8th king. I'm going to read this the way that I think it reads in the Greek. He is the 8th king. He's actually just one of the 7. And he goes into perdition. And so you read, I skipped verse 5, but it says that the beast that was not and yet is. So if you read this, the beast here is the same beast that comes out of the pit in chapter 9 at the 5th trumpet. He comes out of the abyss. He goes unto perdition. If you read through every time Revelation mentions it, the full phrase about him is that he's the beast or the angel, as Revelation 9:11 says, who comes out of the abyss and he goes unto destruction. In fact, the word for destruction here is very close to the word in Greek for Apollyon, which is one of the names for this angel or beast in Revelation chapter 9. So if the beast angel that comes out of the abyss and goes on to perdition is one of these 7, then the other 6 also are as well. And I think what we're seeing, I won't get into the rest of it, but that implies, again, this short space places all of these things as occurring over the span of the final 7 years. And why this woman and the beast are both involved in this activity is because she's represents an entity that is closely aligned with or presiding over the governmental power or influence and religious influence as well that is generating or behind this destruction and coordinating with the beast as well. So that is an overview of where I place this and why I place the 2 witnesses along with all these other things in the second half. Now, that's not to say that none of the events in Revelation are first half events. I think there are certainly first half events. They're just not always specified the exact occurrence of them in that first 3.5 year period, but there certainly are. The 4 horsemen going forth has to be at some point a development that's building towards the midway, towards the movement of Abaddon out of the abyss. Similar with at least the first 5 or 4 trumpets. Those all have to be before the abomination of desolation, which has to occur when the beast is let out of the abyss at the 5th trumpet. The 144,000 being sealed, in my guess, is probably something that happens in the first 3.5 years because, again, that event, their signification that they're sealed is placed right in between the 6th and 7th seal. So it seems to be, again, one of these interruptive events to say, oh, also I got to tell you about this. So that is probably beforehand. And again, I know I'm giving people shorthand. Our studies online have more about this. We're not covering it in this case, but it does tell you, I think, why I think and what some of the major factors that we need to consider. If people are listening and going, I don't know about this, at least I'm hopefully giving you things that you want to factor into whatever your understanding of this subject will be. And so I'll end my commentary there. I want to pause. I know it's 8:03, so we've been right at an hour for tonight. I want to give people a little time to add anything into this conversation. And then if it seems like we have a lot to discuss, I will again hang out afterwards, but we can pause, pray, and then come back and do more discussion if you want. So let's stop for a second. I'm going to stop for a second. Anybody have something that they've been dying to talk about the whole time I've been just going and going?
We'd be here for 3 more hours, Scott.
which I hope we can, get through that conversation, because that to me is part of the fun part for me, is having that dialogue with other people. But I do appreciate the space to lay out some of these factors, and then we can just dispute or discuss or add or build or refine as we go forward. So unless there's anything else that people want to make sure we get in right now, I'll pause. We can pray, and then we'll just hang out for as long as people.
I just had a short point that probably wouldn't take too long, and it's not really changing, the viewpoint or anything like that. Just more like what you were talking about, the space, that short window,
Mhm.
that you said the enemy or the devil, he's got this short window, and his mission is to persecute the saints. Speaks a lot to what Matthew 24 and Mark 13, when he's talking about the Olivet Discourse, and Jesus says, and except in those days be shortened. First it says, for in those days shall be affliction, such was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto the time, neither shall be. And except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, he has shortened the days. So it ties into, there's a period, it looks like, at the end, that his people are being persecuted on a level that's pretty bad. And like, if you said it's Apollyon, whose name is destruction, and that's what he's good at, if he's let to run rampant, there would be no flesh remain. But he had to cut those days short, or for a short season, short span, or cut short for a period of time to stop this utter destruction of all flesh, including, it looks like, the blood of the saints and the martyrs as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Jesus comments about this tribulation period that it is short. It's shorter certainly than the devil would like, and that God's intention there is, I think, in contrast to what happened with Noah, which was only 8 souls were saved. In that case, God's going to make this shorter than the devil would like, at least, and condense it into a 3.5-year period, so that there are more men living that survive this event that God can save, both as his followers, and I do think there is going to be a portion of the nations, maybe just children from the nations, who survive mortally into the kingdom in that respect as well, and maybe certainly some of them will be Jewish, that maybe you're kind of on the fence and not sure, but don't take the mark of the beast as well. So yeah, that's ties in that short period. I think that's a good tie-in. All right, let me pause the recording. Doesn't mean we have to stop talking.